Joel McLeod, and welcome to the 905er. We are halfway through the federal election. As of recording this episode, the federal Liberal Party, under their new leader, Mark Carney, is walking into a majority government. A shocking twist when compared to this time of last year. It is telling that Canadians across the country are rejecting Pierre Poilievre and his Conservatives. Well, at least that's what the polls are showing. There's an old saying in politics, the people are always right. But are they? Are Canadians making the right choice this time around, especially in light of such a turnaround in polling numbers? To discuss this, I've invited to the podcast political columnist and author David Moscrop, whose book, Too Dumb for Democracy, deals with the question of how can we make better political decisions in an election. David has had his writings featured in the Globe and Mail, the National Observer, and Maclean's, among others. You can find his writings on his Substack, davidmoscrop.com. David joins me today. Okay, thank you very much, David Moscrop, for coming back onto the 905er to talk. This time we're going to talk federal politics because, hey, there's a federal election in case you somehow missed that in the news. David, thank you very much for coming on to the 905er.
Thanks for having me.
The reason why I wanted to have you on was through fate, through coincidence, through whatever. I finished the book that you'd written, Too Dumb for Democracy, which was about how we make our political decisions, how we have our political ideologies. I'm going to paraphrase a bit, and I thought that this would be a good time to dive into that. Like, basically the question I have is, are we making the right decision, or how do we make the right decision for our times right now with this federal election? I think this is going to be one of the most important federal elections that we're going to have in a long time. Really determine the fate of the country for, I think, for a good few years. So how do we make sure that we get this right is going to be the question I'm going to pose to you. And you have an hour to explain to Canadians how to vote. Go.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. It doesn't even take that long. I could do it quite a bit quicker than that, but we can find something to talk about after. I mean, I think we're actually doing pretty good. And let's set aside just for a moment all of the particulars about, look, you might be ideological, you might not be ideological, you might be a market fundamentalist, you might be a socialist, well, whatever. Put all that aside for a second because that's core to good politics. But there's other things going on, and let's ask, okay, how are people approaching sorting out who to vote for in the particulars of this exact election? And what seems to happen is there are two elections happening. And David Coletto at Abacus has written and published data on this, and it's really, really interesting. It basically says, look, there's an affordability election, and those folks tend to be conservative, and they tend not to trust the liberals so much looking at the last 10 years. And that's the election they're going through. That's the concern that's primary to them. And the information they have suggests that the Tories, it's their time because they don't trust the liberals on it. The other election is the Trump election, who's best suited to deal with Donald Trump. And voters have said, you know what, we're going to use the sort of mental shortcuts that we have, the data we have, and we've decided that's going to be Mark Carney and the liberals. That's the rough lay of the land. And I'm like, okay, you know what? That's sort of how we want mental shortcuts to work. So far, so good. Then you start to, he's got a good CV. He's got experience in the private sector. He's got experience in the public sector. He knows how politics works. He knows how economics works. He can be in the room with these people and have some sway. And he's not a lightweight and so on. Carney, that is. And that all kind of makes sense. Then you can start to break it down of saying, okay, well, how much do we really know about Carney's policies, though, right? How much do we really know about Poilievre and his policies? Are they going to work? And we start to do the substantive policy evaluation, and then things start to break down a little bit. Then we realize that a lot of what's determining these votes is vibes, and it's a little bit less good. So it looks okay at first. Break it down, looks less good. On balance, it could be a lot worse.
Mhm.
But here we are.
Well, it's the old adage that was attributed to Kim Campbell back when she ran in '93. Elections are the last or the worst time to talk policy. And I mean, we all want to say, "Oh no, we dive into policy and we do a good intellectual deep dive into the pros and cons of each policy and what the effect." Like I think we kid ourselves into that. I've worked in politics, and there's a good chunk of it that is how much am I going to like that person as as prime minister.
Hmm.
I was looking to ask the question, premier or prime minister, you're going to end up listening to that person probably in your daily news cycle every day for the next 4 years, depending where you live. And you have to ask you, like, how do I really want to listen to that person or view that person for the next 4 years?
Hmm.
And we don't want to say that we're that shallow, but my experience has always been, yeah, we kind of are. There always is that, as you said, that vibe check of like, this person makes me feel creepy, or this person makes me feel good about the country or the province or my hometown or wherever. Are we kind of deluding ourselves? We say, oh no, we need to just look at the policy, look at the facts.
What the vibe check is powerful stuff. I mean, I when I'm writing about good political decisions, and I'm talking about, you need to take your time. You need to weigh the evidence. You need to make sure the evidence is good. You got to make sure the reasons that you're coming up with are your own. They're not just someone else's talking point. You got to be able to articulate and share them with others. You should be able to maintain them despite small fluctuations in the environment, from everything from whether or not that person happened to annoy you a little bit that day to whether or not you're hungry. I mean, that's all core to making what I call a good political decision. But at the same time, I argue emotions are still critical to the process. And, I think it was the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio that said if you were to remove emotions from decision making, you wouldn't get perfect rational decision makers, you'd get sociopaths.
Hmm.
We want emotions. They tell us things, right? Emotions are information. They're telling you something about the world. And the vibe check test is actually a good one. And just think about how often you use it in your day-to-day life. You're out in the world, you're meeting people, you're executing business, you're making friends, you're dating, and so on and so forth. And these vibes are telling you something. It's, an emotional cue about whether something is something you ought to approach or someone you ought to avoid. And that's good info. It can be wrong. It can be
Hmm. Hmm.
prejudiced, it can be manipulated for sure, but that first kind of sense, it to me tells you, okay, here's something, I should investigate it more and proceed with caution, and that's really valuable. And I think it's a useful sorting mechanism in a world in which we can't be on the policy 24/7. I think we should be doing more on policy. That's not just, individual voters should be doing it, but media needs to, I think, rebalance the focus between horse race and substance. Same with debate. I just wrote a piece today about debates. Same thing. The debates have become kind of a horse race sideshow clipping for social media. But the vibe is going to be a part of that, whether we like it or not, and it should be. We just need to kind of rebalance to have a little bit more of the policy discussion. But it's a problem in a world in which you don't even get a costed platform from a party these days until the last 10 days of
Well,
the election, if you're lucky.
let's take what you said and let's apply it to this election in the here and now. Because I think the underlying theme that I'm reading when I follow this election is the fact that this time last year, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives were a shoe-in for a supermajority, like record-setting majority, if you believe the polls. Flash forward 1 year later, brand new liberal leader, and all of a sudden that number has reversed. I'm not going to say record-setting liberal majority, but the liberals are polling that they're definitely looking at walking into another fourth term in a comfortable majority government. We will wait and see how the polls turn out on election day, but this is a huge reversal. What's your read into that Canadians have just kind of taken this almost 180 and said, "No, we're going to flip the script again, and we're going to give a really hard look at the Liberals and might give them another fourth term in government."
I mean, there's a few things. One is Justin Trudeau carried a lot of baggage because he was the prime minister for nearly a decade. And I don't care who you are. If you're the prime minister for a long period of time, you're going to accumulate a
Well, he
lot
was in
of
for 10
grievances.
years.
Yeah, right. You're going to
Yeah.
get a lot of grievance. Some of them, those grievances will be fair. Some of them will be unfair. But on balance, after 10 years, people are like, okay, we've had enough, right? They did it to Chrétien, they did it to Harper, they did it to Pierre Trudeau, they did it to Justin Trudeau. They're going to do it to everybody. You have a best before date. So there's part of it. So Trudeau resigns and the Liberals get a bit of a boost and Mark Carney steps in. Now the question is, if Trudeau resigns and Mark Carney steps in, absent Donald Trump, do the Liberals thrive like they thrive now? And I think the answer is no. So Trudeau leaving was a necessary but not sufficient condition. The necessary and sufficient conditions is Trudeau goes, Donald Trump comes in and attacks Canada, threatens economic annexation, making Canada the quote unquote cherished 51st state, levies tariffs, threatens more tariffs. Now it's this big existential question. Okay, so now the Liberals are back because people then look at Mark Carney and say, okay, we think Mark Carney might be able to deal with Donald Trump. We get the sense that he's the right person. He's got a good CV. We don't maybe think Pierre Poilievre is so good at that. Up goes Carney. But it's a little bit more complicated than that because the Tories are maintaining support pretty close to what they had in 2019, 2021. They've gone down a little bit off their high, but they're still pretty high. They're still looking okay. What's changed is the NDP has collapsed. And the NDP is now polling in some cases in single digits and is at risk of losing official party status, which is 12 seats. And the vast majority of that NDP support has gone to the Liberals. So there's still lots of Tory support. There's still lots of concern about affordability. There's still lots of anger at the Liberals for the last 10 years. But all those NDP voters are overlooking all of that and saying, well, we definitely don't want Pierre Poilievre and we definitely don't want Pierre Poilievre to deal with Trump. So we're going to bargain and we're going to vote Liberal. The NDP sinks and the Liberals rise.
I'm not going to challenge you on any of that because I think it's pretty accurate. I am wanted kind of going back to that vibe section that I think my personal take is that that is a very predominant factor in that when you get into the actual thick of an election, a campaign period like we're in now. And I just want to comment, the conservatives seem to have really dug their heels in on this quote unquote manosphere persona, the Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan kind of manosphere isms is the only way I can
Mm.
really describe it. Like we had the Pierre Poilievre saying, women need to get housing before their biological clocks run out. We're recording this just now. There was this really creepy ad put out by Andrew Scheer. It looked like he was in a bar trying to hit on a woman who's texting to the liberal. It was just creepy. I don't know if you've seen it.
I think it was, yeah. I mean, I think it was like he was telling his buddy not to go back to someone he'd broken up with.
Right,
It was like
but
these two dudes at a bar. It was weird.
it was weird, and it's like again that manosphere, bro culture bit. And they seem to be doubling down on it, and I just find that at the same time, it's really alienating women. You have to hear women say, "Yeah, this is really my gig." And I understand people, you're listening. There's two guys on here. We're talking about this, but I've never heard of a political party that can't win without winning over women on a sizable demographic. I'm just wondering what do you make of this kind of doubling down on this bro
Yeah.
culture manosphere influence?
Yeah. I mean, I certainly can't, as you intimate, I certainly can't speak for the women in the electorate, but I can say that it has long been the case, and the data bears this out, that women tend not to support the Tories. That's a broader phenomenon that predates this election. The biological clock thing was interesting because I think, as some people quite fairly pointed out, that, you know, concerns about being able to afford to start a family before you get too old are predominant across genders. But there was something off-putting, something creepy about Pierre Poilievre talking about
Right.
biological clocks like that, so that it was a kind of an aesthetic aversion. But again, that aesthetic aversion comes from somewhere. It's information that people have, and they're like, it's some I don't feel comfortable with that. And that's something that we should take seriously and listen to. And so when, women are like, I don't feel good about that, you're like, okay, let's take that seriously and let's talk about why that's the case. And if you're the conservatives, that's a problem you need to try to fix. And I think part of it is like you suggest is that for a long time, remember they were hashtagging their YouTube videos with men going their own way,
Right.
and
Yep.
MGOTW, to try to get their videos into that algorithm to appeal to disaffected young men in a really kind of uh, toxic way. And this is complicated though. If you look in and see, there's some reporting on this now that like young men are now flocking towards the Tories and Pierre Poilievre. I mean, part of that is alienation, right? That they're having a lot of young men are having a hard time. They're having a hard time making ends meet, like a lot of other people. And there are legitimate affordability concerns. And then there are complicated concerns about the role of masculinity in a contemporary society, and it's changing. And men are getting mixed signals and messages from the cultural sphere, and which is what patriarchy does, by the way. Long-standing argument against
Mhm.
patriarchy is that it's not just bad because it ends up with men dominating women. It also limits what men can be and who they can be and what counts
Right.
as a man, which is extremely toxic. But you then see these men are being radicalized in many ways on YouTube, Reddit, 4chan, wherever they may be getting their content. And the conservatives have been feeding into that in their aesthetics and their messaging. And it's for a while, the electorate kind of shrugged and let it go because everyone was so sick of Trudeau and the Liberals, and off they went. And then not so much because an alternative came in, and things changed. And all of a sudden, okay, well, now we don't have to tolerate that as much as we did before.
I,
This is
I am puzzled though at the, I mean, we're not in the Tory headquarters, so we can't know what's going around the board table, but I am puzzled with the doubling down on it, it seems, is that
it's
the
crazy.
I can understand, okay, we tiptoe into it. You get a lot of backlash from women and progressives saying like this, I don't like this. This is creepy. I don't know what your intention is. When you could have said, okay, we need to make buying a new home affordable for new families. I think that's kind of a
For sure.
more ubiquitous phrase. And I think what he was trying to get at was that, for new young families, they need to be able to afford a house and start their lives. And they
Hmm.
can't do that. And you kind of go, why didn't you just say that? But
Yeah,
instead of it's trying to,
that was my feeling. It was like there are
instead,
better ways to say this.
right. And instead of saying, you're right, like I tripped over my words, it's like, no, I'm just going to double down, and it's, woke, and it's anti woke or whatever. And I just find that it's puzzling for me to see like, okay, can you not take a lesson from the public and switch your messaging to
What?
again target, because I think he's right.
For sure.
Young families need to be able to afford a home, build up equity, get their family started. That is kind
Yeah.
of the building block of the Canadian economy, in my opinion.
And a lot of social and cultural
That
units, right? Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole other episode on
Yeah.
that one. But just that unwillingness to say, "Oh yeah, mea culpa, my bad. I tripped over my words. This is what I meant." What do you read into that? Just that an unwillingness to accept, I screwed up. Okay, let's move on.
Oh yeah. It's like what was that thing? Is it oppositional defiance disorder? Like there's just this intransigence that is born of true belief. And I read a couple of books on Polyev recently. Mark Bory's book,
Hmm.
Ripper, which is quite good, and Martin Lukasz's book, The Pierre Polyev or the Polyev Project. And they're both quite good and make good reading next to one another. But one of the things you take away from reading them and from talking to people that know Pierre Polyev is that the guy is a true believer. He made up his mind in high school about what he believed, and he never changed his mind. He was a free market fundamentalist libertarian, and he's always been that way. To that, he's now added a kind of, or at least emphasized a kind of cultural backlash politics that is very popular. amongst many and helped serve the Donald Trump in the United States, but which is not playing in Canada among the plurality that you need to win government as well as the Tories might hope. Because most people, they don't really care about that stuff that much, right? They don't like most people aren't going to vote based on how, what the conservatives' policies are on trans people. They're not going to
I,
vote based
I, I,
on,
I want, there's something that popped in my head. I just want to put it out there
yeah.
before I lose it. But because I think you're right, and I thought what you just said is also the reason why Justin Trudeau kind of they kicked him out the door was that this doesn't matter that much to people. The average Joe and Jane Canadian, they're more worried about their paychecks. They're more worried about, can I pay off the mortgage this month? Can I put food on the table? Can I put money away for my kids' education? Can I go on that vacation I've been planning? Those are things that Canadian, they care about
Mhm.
that. They're not, I don't think people are mean or not valid, but they say like, that's not where my priorities are. My priorities are on my family and my household. And I thought like Pierre was kind of hitting at that. It was like, we need to get back to the basics of the economy. And they seem to, this election to have kind of thrown out the window because we want to talk about woke and this kind of grievance culture that did serve Donald Trump south of the border. I don't
Oh,
think it's going
yeah.
to, it's one of those things that gets an careful what you wish for
Oh, yeah. It's not going to work
scenario.
here. Yeah, it's not, that's not how you win here. And I don't want to make it seem like these issues aren't important. I mean, I do think, you know, a policy on what our science looks like and what we fund is incredibly important.
Right.
Our policy on trans folks is incredibly important. I think the answer is you let people be who they are and you give them maximal freedom to be who they are and support them and let them make their own decisions.
Mhm.
Incidentally, which you would think incidentally it would be a conservative value, right?
That
Freedom.
yes, and
But
again,
but
that's what I'm trying to. You phrase it better than
yeah,
I could. But that's what I don't understand.
but
I thought it was about giving you freedom to do and be who you
if
are.
you're a libertarian, the libertarian position should be government has no business in telling someone what their gender
Right,
or sexuality is and how
right.
they should behave with that gender or sexuality.
As
That's
long as
their
you don't
business.
harm someone else.
Yeah, exactly. Now this is the trick though, is they try
Right,
to
right, right, right.
morph it into something harmful because they need to try to fit their anti-trans, et cetera, anti-LGBTQ plus policies, some conservatives. They need to make that make sense, and that's what they do. I talked to Ira Wells recently about his book on book banning, and I asked him, how do these, freedom lovers sell a book ban?
Mhm.
Right? How do they square that circle? And he's like, well, they never call it a book ban. They say they're getting pornography off the shelves, right? Like when they go ban, quote unquote, these woke DEI trans books off the shelves, it's always like, no, no, we're protecting the children from this harm.
Right.
Which is totally bogus, but that's the argument. And it's the same thing here. And the conservatives can't help themselves because, when Polyev focuses on affordability and the economy, he had a winning message for a long time and still to a large extent does because people continue to struggle. But then he can't help himself, and his party can't help themselves. They dip into these culture wars where, again, most people are like, I don't care. Or even if people care, their revealed preferences tell us they don't actually care that much. They care about how much money they have and whether they can afford things. They don't care substantively, deeply, significantly to the point that it's going to determine their vote over this stuff, which is still important, but is incidental to how the plurality of voters are making their electoral decisions. So they can't help themselves. Some of it is throwing red meat to the base, but again, that is not a winning strategy because then people start to turn around and say, "Oof, these guys are a little extreme for me."
Well, let's talk about that base for a second because it seems to me that the conservatives are doubling down on that base support that they have. Ironically, I think at the consequence of losing a lot of the other majority of Canadians who are in that mushy middle. And as you said, they're leaving the NDP in favor of going to the Liberals. So I I, I guess my question is like this these culture war arguments that we're seeing pop up outside of America, I haven't seen them work anywhere to win. The only time that I would argue that they did work to win a cause was during Brexit, and that has turned out
Mhm.
disastrous for Britain. That a lot of uh, the British people, I would say if they could do the vote over again, they would vote to remain part of the EU. But like we've seen in Germany, they try and the rise of the AfD. That's failed. In France, Marie Le Pen's party tried to win, and that's consistently failed through one way or another. Are these culture war issues a dead end? I'd say, and I mean, maybe that says more about America uh, at the moment, but
Yeah.
I've seen it, they keep popping up, but I've never seen them actually work outside of America to elevate the right-wing parties to power.
Yeah, I mean they do have it depends on how you define win. I think the AfD would in some senses would declare their rise a win in the way that the Reform Party in the UK, who trades in this stuff too, would also declare their rise a win. It hasn't ushered them into power though. There was some of this in Argentina, so it did sort of have an effect in Argentina. And of course, there's Orban in Hungary, but there are other things going on there too. So, absent all things being equal, does this tip the scales in Australia or New Zealand or Canada, even the UK? I don't think so, because again, I think for most voters, they, or at least a plurality of would-be voters of the sort who are going to return you to government or not, they aren't concerned that much about these things. And this is like this old thing in polling, and this is such a canard. We find it all over the place. It was in, God help us, it was in an episode of The West Wing. Uh, how much do you care? Like, do you care about this thing? Like, yeah, I care about this thing. Well, I really care about, like, someone gets really worked up about, you know, um, book bans or something like that. Like, we got to get these books off the shelves. Okay, then you ask the, people in general whether or not they care. And they might say, oh, yeah, I care about that. And you're like, how much do you care? It's like, none, right? Like,
Mhm.
people care about affordability in jobs. They care about healthcare. They care about, at the moment, tariffs and Trump, which is basically affordability in jobs. We restate affordability in jobs three or four different ways. And they care about climate, more or less, although not right now. And then they kind of care about nothing else. Not really. Everything else kind of falls by the wayside. And so this stuff isn't powerful for that. It is powerful, though, for mobilizing true believers and probably for raising money. Because if it was like it was the thing that everyone cared about, there would be, the PPC would be soaring, and they're not.
I am back here, folks. I apologize. We had some technical issues, but we're back at it. I wanted to ask you, David, about the appeal of Mark Carney, because I don't want this entirely to be about the Conservative Party. And basically, what's the how is it? And Mark Carney seems to be the right guy at the right time with Donald Trump and his tariff proposals, with
Mhm.
affordability. He seems to be the guy that Canadians have been wanting so far. And I wanted your insight on that, or is this just we're putting all of our hopes on one man? And is this kind of Trudeau again back in 2015? We're putting all of our hopes on this one man fix our problems, and are we just setting ourselves up for maybe a disappointment in a year's time?
Well, I mean, I think the nature of our system is we are always putting our hope in one person, for better or worse. We always end up disappointed because that person cannot possibly live up to our expectations. And that's why you get people turning on prime ministers, no matter who they are, at some point. That's not a new phenomenon, by the way. Winston Churchill helped win the Second World War and was immediately voted out of office in the subsequent election, right? Like, this is, there are sometimes people's expectations, they change. What they want
Mhm.
changes. But on Carney, he almost seems like he comes out of central casting. And I previously wrote how he wasn't the man for the moment because, like, he was a technocrat and an elite, an insider, all of the things that you would expect people would be opposed to in this moment of populist anger and anti-elitism and anti-technocracy. And then I'm about to be proven wrong. And then there's a Trump factor in it, of course, which explains some of it. But also, I think I underestimated the extent to which, in a moment of crisis, people want a kind of stolid, reliable figure that they kind of feel comfortable with, who reminds them of a kind of trusted parent, right? Who's going to calm things down. And there's that one person at a Carney rally that shouted something Big Daddy or
Right,
something.
right, 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 right.
It
Yep.
was incredibly cringe, but also there's something there. Like people want a parent, a soothing parent. And Carney aesthetically and via CV ticks all of the boxes. And I think that's going to be disappointing at some point. But for the moment right now, boy, that's extraordinarily powerful.
I always kind of view Mark Carney right now. He reminds me a lot of my dad,
A lot
and
of people are saying this.
I think that's the shared vibe across country. It's like he's a dad.
A lot of people are saying this, and like I'm doing the meme, but it's true. And he's likable. His favorables are quite high, and as David Coletto at Abacus points out, rather extraordinarily, his numbers are improving. His favorables are improving. Or actually, rather, his net negatives are improving. His net favorables are improving, which is extraordinary during the election.
Mhm.
That's wild. People are getting to know him more, and they're liking him more. And he kind of comes off as like dad core, and at a moment in which people want someone that they feel is dependable, that they have a very strong CV, that they have the right aesthetic, because that's part of it too. And we can break that apart and say, okay, well, let's actually look at the policy here and what we're expecting. Angela McEwen today had a really good piece in her Substack about how Carney could very well, for all of his uh, capacity in all of his positives, is really kind of threatening a potential austerity budget, which would be really harmful. That's her argument, and I find it quite compelling. So we can dig into that. But aesthetically, right now, and in terms of his CV, he's again kind of like at essential casting, and that really contrasts with Polyev, who's wildly unlikable and unliked.
Uh, Kind of my last question to you, and this is again bringing it back to your book. This is a bit more the rational side of this electoral question I've been pondering, and I also want to tie this into the provincial election we had here in Ontario just previously, because
Mm.
the Conservatives and the right, and I'm going to throw in Doug Ford into this. I know people are going to say, "Oh, Doug Ford and Pierre probably like the same," and they are, but they are both right wing conservatives, and both of them kind of approach the Trump dilemma as, okay, we need to get past Trump and we're going to go back to normal. We're going to go back to our normal American Canadian relations. We're going to go, you know, cars going across the border, trade flowing freely, no tariffs, and it'll be back to normal. And I'm getting the sense the rest of the country is saying, no, we just don't trust the Americans anymore. If they, Trump, first Trump term, okay, everybody makes a mistake. The second time, they reelected him knowing what he did the first time, what he was promising this time. And I kind of get the sense that the rest of Canada is saying, no, we just don't trust them. And that's kind of Carney. I think Mark Carney's appeal is the fact of saying, no, we'll go to Europe, the Europeans. We're going to form new trade ties with the Europeans, with the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians, and the Kiwis in New Zealand. And I guess my question
Yeah.
is that what kind of why we're seeing this divide? Is that the conservatives can't seem to get their imagination around what comes after Trump? Because on my thing is there's always going to be somebody worse than Trump. We think he's the worst they can do. No, I'm pretty sure there's somebody worse that we just don't know about yet in America. And we need to kind of guard
Yeah.
ourselves for that. And my hope is Carney's the man to kind of start that work. Is that a fair way to kind of approach this election question from a more rational point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think the rational approach starts with collecting the facts. And Trump raised the 51st state canard in the first term, but he's gone all in on it in his second term. There were steel and aluminum tariffs in the first term and a renegotiation of NAFTA. Now there's widespread tariffs, the threat of more, and a total tearing down of that trade relationship, and another renegotiation of the USMCA or CUSMA, whatever you want to call it, that Trump praised as the greatest deal ever a couple of years ago after
Right.
negotiating it, and now wants to tear apart. And so, yes, something has changed and is big. And we're seeing what Carney has basically said, a reworking in real time of the global trade system. The rules are changing. The hegemon is changing. The US is looking inward. It's becoming a very, very dangerous state, increasingly more of a dangerous state. It's long been a dangerous state for much of the world. But even now we're seeing people detained at the border. We're seeing people disappeared to foreign prisons illegally without recourse and left there when they're found to be innocent. I mean, we're seeing an authoritarian and quite frankly fascist doubling down. And so, yeah, I think the Canada looks around and says, okay, well, we boo the national anthem, we cancel bookings to the United States. That tourism industry could take a $3.4 billion hit from Canadians canceling over the next year because we want to show our displeasure, but also we don't trust the country anymore. That 80% of our exports have gone to world's longest undefended border, deep integration through military interoperability through NATO and NORAD. Now we're like, nope, that doesn't work for us. And so we're looking elsewhere. And people like Paul Yev, Danielle Smith is a big proponent of this, is like, as you suggest, we just need to get through this. And everyone else is like, no, we need to reorder. We need to look around the world and recognize that the old ways aren't going to hold anymore. And even if Trump were to leave tomorrow, we just don't trust the US anymore because one, they just elected this guy for a second time. They could do it again, as you suggest. I don't think JD Vance is necessarily going to be better. I think he'd in some ways potentially be worse. And so this is a huge problem. So yeah, and I think Carney recognizes that and has the capacity to reimagine a different order. The work will then be to say, okay, especially the work on the left, to say, okay, well, how do we make sure that's better, more sustainable, good for workers, good for the environment, has cultural protections, isn't exploitative, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of anxieties there, but that's going to be day two. Day one is recognizing that we have to rework the trade policy that has been a part of this country, in some ways stretching back to the Auto Pact in the 60s, and defense policy stretching back, longer into the post-war era. How do we wrap our heads around that? And then how do we build out after? And I think people look at Polyev and say, no, that's not the guy for that. They look at Jagmeet Singh and say, definitely not the guy for that. And they look at Carney and say, you know what? Yeah, I think he probably has the chops for it. And then they work back from there.
I mean, we'll find out on April 28th what the actual result of all this will be. Right now, it's all hypothesis at the moment. I do question. I do wonder about the future of the country. And just as much as I'm not. I mean, I am not a fan of Donald Trump. Uh, I am very hesitant of the United States and just what I'm beginning to question whether or not what that country has to offer the world. Truth be told, it's a country without any manufacturing base. It has a lot of it is just intellectual copyright material that they kind of will sell off to the rest of the world. Is basically what their economy is at the moment. Um, I mean, I'm not an economist. I don't know what the future is going to be, but I have to wonder if I, I just don't see the value in hitching our ride to the Americans at the moment, especially because I think the Chinese are going to be. They see this as their shot. I think we see in the next 4 years. This is our shot to really
Oh, yeah.
take us to the next level, and you know, they're hungry. The Chinese are hungry
It,
for that top spot in the world.
the meme has come to life, do nothing, comma, win. China is sitting back. They're not doing nothing. That incidentally, they're
Right.
a manufacturing powerhouse that is diversifying their technologies and greening up a lot of their technologies incidentally too. I mean, they burn a lot of coal, but they're also developing other capacities. And the US, as you mentioned, there's a highly financialized economy, a highly service-based economy, and not a manufacturing economy. But this is exactly what Trump is trying to reverse. His hypothesis is we have a trade deficit with the world because the world is quote unquote ripping us off. He mistakes financial deficits and trade deficits because he's economically illiterate. And we simultaneously, incidentally, don't build anything anymore, which, by the way, is true. The manufacturing economy has
Yeah.
declined, But that doesn't mean the country's being ripped off. It means they've specialized into other areas. But anyways, that's an aside point. But so he wants to reshore manufacturing or to shore manufacturing, as a few people pointed out on the internet recently. No iPhone has ever been built in the United States. That's not reshoring. That's not bringing iPhone manufacturing back from Taiwan or China or India. That is trying to create iPhone factories for the first time. Ditto with all kinds of other manufacturing capacities. That's his bet, is with tariffs, we're going to force all these companies back. That's probably not going to happen. And so not only uh, will the US not offer the value proposition of manufactured goods that we want to buy, their economy could fall apart as consumers face tariffs and no factories coming online to create the jobs that Trump thinks. So yeah, I mean, I think, we're deeply integrated in many economies. So a lot of our resources go south, they get value added, they get shipped back north. That's hard to decouple from overnight, right? So
Mhm.
Canada would have to find someone else, and there's really no one else because what are you going to do? Send it across the Atlantic or the Pacific? Or we're going to have to come up with those capacities ourselves. So we're going to still be bound to that economy to some extent. Aluminum is a good example of this. Aluminum goes south in these rolls, they make it into stuff, they send it back. But, auto parts cross the border, whatever it is, 5, 8 times. Uh, but we might start saying, okay, well, we're going to find some ways to kind of hedge here and there. Because as economists have put it to me, is the natural benefits of north-south trade will remain very, very strong because there's a massive market that's connected to us by land and is very, very close, with whom we share a language and cultural connections, et cetera, et cetera. So there's going to be that value proposition to some extent, no matter what. But the old days of like, we're all in on this one basket, untenable.
Well, that's what I mean, we've heard that from economists we had on previous episode. I'll put in the show notes, folks. The President's Chamber of Commerce for Newmarket, as well as for Burlington, just to talk about what this means locally. And that's the thing; they're the kind of same ideas that we're never going to completely uncouple from the United States, but we are going to need to start finding new markets to sell our wares and services to. Quite frankly, I can't think of any other market other than Europeans, Japanese, South Koreans, Australians,
One another,
well,
more domestic too.
it kind of brings well that's that I'm waiting to see. When Carney came out and said on July 1st we're tearing down all the interprovincial trade barriers, I was like, if you do that, amazing, uh, because I that to me has been the biggest hurdle of any prime minister since Confederation is to just get goods going east west instead of north south. There's no reason why we should not be able to buy Kelowna wines on Ontario shelves. Just I don't understand. I always thought there should be a Canada first. That's a bad way of phrasing it. My apologies, everyone. But a right of first refusal for Canadian energy. Any surplus that
Right,
we
yeah.
generate in Quebec or in Ontario, the other provinces should have a right of first refusal at a fair market value for that energy. We should be
If you can
powering
transmit
ourselves.
it. This is
Well,
part of the challenge, right? Is
well,
that
that's just
the
it. I mean, that's just it. Like we need to start investing in east-west
you know,
trade corridors, and I know,
yeah,
and
power
that's
grids.
power grids, and yeah, maybe pipelines. I mean, I'm very skeptical, and just because well, Energy East was canceled not because Trudeau said I don't want a pipeline. I think he would have said I'll build the pipeline myself if I can, but it just wasn't market sustainable.
No.
Now with Trump's tariffs and we've seen the crash of oil prices, is that still viable? I don't know. I mean, I'm not an oil industry expert, so I can't know if they
Yeah.
can make the numbers work. But I think it's worth giving it a shot. But
Well, this is the
that's a
other
very
challenge. So nobody knows what the markets are going to look like. And all parties are talking about more of a quote unquote, for lack of a better phrase, Canada first economic policy, including more infrastructure, more internal trade. Both the Tories and the Liberals want a quote unquote energy corridor. This is the Tory language, but the Liberals kind of want something similar. And that includes not just, potential pipelines, but grids and transmission lines and
right.
roads and all the things that you need to build this stuff up, mines to mine this stuff. And there's talk about it, but there's we don't know what the global market's going to look like for LNG for oil. As you mentioned, the case against Energy East was the market doesn't want to build it because they don't want to put the capital investment forward because they don't think they're going to make their money back, or it's too risky. I think right now, in some senses, it's become even more risky. And if we continue to move towards renewable energies, cleaner energies, that further diminishes the case. And so then we start talking about, well, is the state going to do these things then? Are we going to have another TMX because the market won't touch it?
Mm.
So we're going to have all these state projects. And what do those look like? So we've entered this extraordinarily interesting time, a time that's potentially ripe for a flourishing of nation building, the likes of which you haven't seen in decades. But
Well,
we don't know what that's going to look like.
maybe I'm just not an optimist. I'm an optimist at heart, but I like to think there's an opportunity here that we have a real opportunity to. We have an abundance of natural resources in Ontario and in Quebec. I'd like to see us, instead of just digging them out and shipping them to America for or to China for processing. I think I'd love to see it. Just bring it down south here to Hamilton. And refine it into the metal that we need, either that's for the auto industry or for building housing that apparently we are not building in Ontario.
Yeah.
That's an opportunity to build an economy.
I've
That,
seen some economists sort of say the economics of that in some cases are appealing, in other cases aren't appealing, like especially with, refining, for instance. It was like it didn't make sense for us to refine our own oil. That's part of the reason we shipped it south, was that it was just a better arrangement. Of course, though, if you can't do that anymore, then it changes. But this is the challenge: is that we've entered this moment of a potentially quite exciting time in nation building and reorienting the economy, growing the economy in ways that can be really, really productive. But we also don't know what the market's going to look like, and we don't know what the conditions and returns are going to look like. And that means a lot of people aren't going to want to touch those things. And so the state's going to have to do it or find a way to underwrite it. And so we're setting up for a big battle, I think, over to what extent the state gets involved in these projects and how. And incidentally, how we manage concerns that have been completely abandoned in this election, Indigenous rights and title and reconciliation, which is itself complicated because some Indigenous uh, entities, bands, whatever it may be, want these projects and some don't, and they cross borders, and that's complicated.
that
And then of course the environment, which we also have to deal with, which we've sort of forgotten. So it's going to be a mess.
it's going to be a mess, but I want to hopefully believe it's a good mess because
Yeah.
we do know that the markets are unstable. Donald Trump has really just kind of kicked over the Jenga tower of the global financial market system, and we're all trying to figure out, well, where do we fit into this new mess? So does everybody else.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's a chance for us as a country to kind of come together and say we know our worth. I think if there's a real opportunity for Canada coming on top, we have an abundance of natural resources. We are well educated in all fields in the world, and we are in the north. We are having a massive trade route that has opened up that will be position us to be a power to China, America, Russia, and the Europeans.
If
And
we can defend it.
well, that's it. But I mean, I think that's a good place to start. We need to build an economy. Let's remobilize. We can build warships on the east and west coast. Send them up to the north to patrol. We can fuel them with our own fuel. We don't, we have a lot of opportunities to do this. We've just always kind of said, no, the Americans will kind of defend us for a while. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think Carney's going to the Swedes and saying, "We'll build your Saab Griffin jet fighters here in Canada" is a smart move. It gives us a chance to
That
integrate
was
with
their
new
initial
allies.
deal, incidentally, with the Gripens, is they said they would build them here, and we went with the F-35s for purposes of interoperability and appeasing the Americans. And there's
Right.
some fight over what's the better fighter jet and whatever, whatever. But really, it was like we were never going to go buy filthy European planes. And now I'm seeing a lot of serious people say, well, some of them say that we need to cancel the F-35 contract outright, and others say, no, no, what you want to do is fulfill the initial tranche and then diversify the fleet with the Grippins or the French, what is it, Rafales or whatever they are. And
Mhm.
but these are the conversations to have now. But this gets back to the broader point of to bring it around to the question we started with was, okay, we're in the moment of global order transition and potential decline of the hegemon that may become God knows what is descending into fascism and so on, and we're next door. And we have decisions to make about how we look outward, how we deal with the United States, but also how we deal with ourselves inward. And that means, managing the federation, deciding on infrastructure and industrial policy in a serious way for the first time, probably in decades,
Mhm.
dealing with the persistent affordability issues while still managing Indigenous reconciliation and climate. And we need someone who's going to be able to juggle all of those balls at once. And who is that person? Or who's most likely to be the best person to do that? Because no one's going to be perfect. And people are looking at the leaders and saying, that's on balance, 40x% of us say that's Carney.
Yeah, we're saying that. Whether or not he'll live up to the expectation, who knows? I think it'll be a testament to the liberals for picking a leader who. Because I don't. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think a political party has ever gone into a fourth term after 10 years of power in recent years.
The
I can't think of one that's been
the
given a fourth term in power.
Not a fourth majority. I mean, the Chrétien liberals did it. They had, 93,
Right.
97, 2000, and then 2003, whatever the Paul Martin
Yeah.
minority was. That was fairly short-lived and fairly weak. That was a moribund government.
I think it was a
Uh,
year, wasn't it? Or
yeah,
year and a
yeah,
bit.
something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah, and prior to that, Pierre Elliott Trudeau tried to do it in 79, lost to Joe Clark. Incidentally, whatever it was, 6 months later, he won a majority. So they sort of almost did it, but it took them losing before they could come back. So they weren't able to do that. Four in a row for a single. Then, of course, before that, it's Pearson hands over the reins to Trudeau Sr. So the Liberals managed that in the 60s.
Right.
But I mean, so it's been a long time and it's hard to do. Harper didn't do it, Mulrooney didn't do it. And that goes way back to the
If it,
80s. And no prime
uh,
minister since Laurier had done it themselves 4 times. That was what Trudeau was going for before he
right.
backed off.
So 1960. I mean, we're looking almost two generations back, uh, which is huge in terms of politics. I'm going to last question, and I'll let you go. But if the Conservatives do lose after this on April 20th, if Pierre Poilievre does not deliver them the majority that they're expecting, what do you think the future is of the Conservative Party in this country? Because I'm my take is if you at this point the Liberals have defeated Harper, Scheer, O'Toole, and this time it'll be Pierre Poilievre, four leaders. That's that to me. That's a red flag. You got to do some serious gut checks, serious
Yes.
internal reconciliation. Uh,
Yeah.
my worry is though that they're going to double down on as we said earlier the manosphere, that angry male demographic is where they're going to go because I think they're comfortable in their anger. Is my worry instead of
Yeah.
actually presenting an alternative vision to move the country forward.
Such a good question. I've thought about it a lot because I asked myself the question is if Pierre Poilievre loses, does he go as leader? And the answers I got people was, well, if he loses and it's a majority for the Liberals, then he probably does go. If it's a minority, he probably stays. I don't know if that's true or not. That's what some people are thinking, and that could be true. I think it's a mistake to ditch your leader after one election. They did it to Scheer, they did it to O'Toole, both of whom had more votes than Justin Trudeau in each of those elections. Not more seats, and it's the seats that count, but the
Mm-hmm.
Tories won more votes in both 2019 and 2021, back to back. That's extraordinary. It doesn't happen often in Canada, but they did. And but go back to Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper took a while to get up and running, and then he became their most successful prime minister in a very, very long time. They gave him a chance, though, as leader. But if you go back, okay, how many majorities have the Tories won since 1960? 88, well, since 1989, let's go back. Since after the 1988 election, the answer is one. They've won one majority since 1989. It's 36 years. That's wild. Like, you've got a structural problem there if you win one. Now, the
Right.
liberals the liberals enjoyed more majorities in part because of a collapsed right through the 90s and early 2000s, and only one majority since the right united. But okay, still, they do still win, and they seem to be heading for another one. So the conservatives have, as you mentioned, a structural problem to deal with, and I don't know how they're going to deal with that. There's rumblings that they're going to try to get, that Doug Ford wants the job. They're complaining right now that
I've heard that, and
yeah,
no,
this
it's
is
not.
the thing that they're saying now is that the conservatives are saying that, this is why tonight is attacking Jenny Byrne and Poilievre, is because Doug Ford wants the job. But whatever the truth of that or not, which I still think is kind of unlikely, least of which because he doesn't speak French, is, or at least not well, is that's not who they really are as a party. And I think they're probably locked into the Poilievre style for a while. But at some point, I think it's also going to work. At some point, people will get tired of the liberals. It's good, one way or the other. I think that's going to happen. You're not going to have, or you may not, you probably won't have the extraordinary Trump moment that you had in 2025 in 2029. I
Mm.
don't think. So, they could just be waiting it out. And honestly, I'm not a conservative. I don't want the conservatives to win. I don't agree with Pierre Poilievre's politics or his aesthetics. I don't like either of those things. But if I'm the conservatives, I would actually keep him around. I bet you he'd be a very fierce opposition leader. And I'm just talking tactically for like big politics brain for a second, because I also think he's going to be toxic and very bad for democracy. And I wish that he weren't the leader. But strategically, I think keeping him is probably not the worst idea. But I think the conservatives have a tendency to kind of shiv their leaders after a loss, and I think he'll be facing a lot of pressure to leave if they lose.
I would imagine he'd be facing a lot of pressure, especially when the polls are showing you're going to be a 200 plus seat supermajority in the House, and now we're kind of back where we started.
Yeah,
And it's that question that would be eating me as a conservative. I
yeah,
kind of look and say it's the same thing that happened with Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals. Is you're supposed to be delivering the results and you didn't. So what do we do? And that's kind of the
yeah,
question I think provincially the Ontario Liberals and the federal Conservatives might have to start looking at. Is like, are we reaching the people that we need to give us the government that we want to be?
yeah. You
And
can't just call yourself the people's opposition.
what, no, because what people is my question. It's the question I always have. But that is a whole other
That's a
episode
different episode. Okay.
that maybe we'll. I'm figure we'll be probably doing that in a few months, probably in the fall. But David, thank you very much for coming on and chatting federal politics. Always a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me.